Hello again, fellow audiophiles. I am Wave Theory, and this is the Aune S9c Pro DAC with headphone amplifier. This has a couple of different color options, black or the silver that you see here. It has a starting price of $699 US, or if you get the Bluetooth version, that will run the cost up to $739 US. This was sent to me for review from Aune, which more on the pronunciation of that name in just a moment. Okay, for review, they have asked nothing in return other than a fair and honest evaluation, which you are about to receive. I will also include an affiliate link to Amazon in the description below. So if you like what I have to say about this product and you want to buy it, please consider using that affiliate link. I will get a small kickback if you do, and that just helps me keep the channel running. All right, I say DAC with headphone amp in it because that is how Aune markets it. You may consider this an all-in-one or a DAC amp kind of thing because that is what it is. However, the framing that Aune chooses to use there seems to indicate to me that they see this as a product that is more meant to be a DAC than it is meant to be a headphone amp. But I will go ahead and evaluate both of those functions, both as a DAC and as a headphone amp, or all-in-one, I should say, here, DAC and headphone amp together, and talk about where it fits in the market there, and because that all-in-one category right there of DAC and headphone amp combos around that $500 to $800 price is getting pretty crowded right now. So where does this one fit in? Well, find out right after shameless self-promotion.
Hi, it's me again, 14 months later and a whole foot taller. Now, since Wave Theory liked the first 10,000 subscriber play button I made him, maybe he wants a 25,000 subscriber play button. This can only happen if you subscribe, though. Now, since over 60% of the watch time comes from unsubscribed viewers, I'm going to need you to subscribe. You can also sign up for his Patreon or send him money in PayPal. Links in the description. Now, on to the video.
Given that we have a fully featured DAC and a headphone amp in here, we have a fair amount of ground to cover, so as always, I'm going to do my best to cover all of that, and so that means we might be here for a while. So use the timestamps, jump around, watch the things that are of most interest and relevance to you. Otherwise, grab your favorite beverage, get comfortable, and let's talk about the Aune S9c Pro. Now, why am I saying Aune? I have normally pronounced the name of this company as Aune because that's kind of, or Aune or Aune or things like that seem to be the common pronunciation here in the Western world, at least in the YouTube sphere, as to the name of this company. In speaking with their representatives at CanJam SoCal just a few weeks ago, I filmed this video in early October of 2025, they were saying that they pronounced the name, or the correct pronunciation is Aune. I'm going to do my best to say it that way, but if I happen to revert, that's just because a habit has been formed. I'm trying to break it, so preemptive apologies to the folks at Aune if I mess the name up again throughout the course of this review. All right. So again, we have a roughly $700 DAC and headphone amplifier here. Let's talk about some of the other specs in it here. It is built, the DAC section is built around a pair of ES9068 DAC chips in it. It will decode PCM files up to 32-bit 768 kilohertz, and it will do several times oversampling of DSD. I can't remember if it's DSD 256 or DSD 512. I forgot to write it down, but it's going to be one of those two in there. The headphone amp in it is rated with a very generous power output of 5 watts per channel, which sounds really high to me, both on paper and in practice. They don't really say into what load that 5 watts per channel is rated. I have some comments about that coming up. I'm thinking that it doesn't sound like a 5 watt per channel amp should sound like to my ears anyway. So I'll talk more about that as we move along with the review here. But I mean, other than that, like we can start getting into the meat of the review here. My basic takeaways on this piece are that it is a quite competent all-in-one. Like, it is a really rock-solid option up there at around $700. The DAC performance is strong. The amp performance, even though I made that comment about being surprised by the rated power spec, the amp performance is also quite solid. You put them together and you get a pretty good sounding and flexible device here that I think will meet the all-in-one needs of a fair number of users out there. Okay, and then where it fits in the market, I think it's appropriately and fairly priced even still for the most part. I'm going to save the deep market analysis of this for a future video. So a little bit of a teaser as to what's coming up in the near future. The S9c here is like one of the last kind of, for lack of better term, mid-fi DAC amps that I need to review before I feel comfortable doing a big roundup video of a bunch of different DAC amps, which would include like this one, the D&A Alpha Pro, things like the HiFiMan HE600 and the HiFiMan Golden Wave Serenade and the Luxon X9, and there are others, right? That's not all of them, but just a big roundup of all of those kinds of devices. Okay, in there here in the near future. So just be on the lookout for that, and we'll do more of the market analysis of this piece there, I think. All right, so the build on this. If you are familiar with the build of Aune's amplifiers, the S series, the S9c Pro, the S9c Pro Evo, same chassis, okay? Same look, okay, same design, same basic everything, okay, except for, like, you know, you've got this display here that, because it's a DAC and an amp, it's got to display some different information. So when it's lit up, and I've got a picture of that to show you here and to put it on the screen next to one of their amps, okay, there's just, it's a little bit simpler display. It's not as bright, it's not as visually intrusive as the display on those amps can be to some people at some times, I think. So I mean, that's just a little bit different. That's neither complaint nor compliment. It just is what it is. But I mean, you have a multi-function knob here where it's clicky as you turn it. It's also a button. Okay, you see that we have the 3 flavors of headphone output here. I would use the balanced outputs because the amplifier in this is of balanced design. There is a remote control, basically identical to the remote controls of the other Aune products here. Okay, where it's got just the 5 buttons for input select. You've got power output level, like high or low current mode, basically in there. You've got the output select between the headphone amp and the preamp output. Okay, and then you have volume control on there. So simple, easy to use remote there. That's also just like visually striking and different looking from other brands' remote controls. Back panel. Okay, here are the analog outputs from the DAC. Again, they are variable output, so this can serve as a preamp. Okay, more than just a DAC there. You've got the XLR balanced outputs. You have the single-ended RCA outputs. You've got a bevy of digital inputs here. You've got 3 flavors of SPDIF in that AES, and then Toastlink SPDIF, and then coax RCA right there. Okay, then you have the USB input here. You see the antenna. They sent me the Bluetooth version, so here's the antenna for that. And then this BNC connector right here is for the 10 megahertz clock input. Aune also sells an external 10 megahertz clock. You don't have to buy theirs. There are other 10 megahertz clocks out there. I did not try that feature because I don't have one of those on hand, but you've got the clock input there for those who want it. All right. So with that, I mean, the other part about the build and the features here is like the other Aune S series products, this does get warm, but not as warm to the touch as like that S17, those S17 amps do. Okay, not even close to that. So just slightly warm to the touch, not quite hot like those amps can get in there. So you do need to give it some room to breathe. If you're going to stack it with those amps and just use it as a DAC / preamp, I would put this one on the bottom just so that those amps don't have something on top of them to hold more heat in. Okay, that sort of thing. That's just something to keep in mind there. Okay, with that, I think we can start transitioning to sound. So what was my test gear on this? So again, I'm an all digital music listener. I would have listened to either lossless or high-res FLAC files, or DSD files played locally. In the case of FLAC files, they could have also been streamed from Qobuz. All of that through Roon. A couple of different Roon endpoints were used here. FIO SR11 was used either direct USB connection in some cases, or routed through a Singer SU6 DDC and then connected via coaxial input on here. I also used my Asus ZenBook laptop, which is a Windows 11 machine, and then direct USB into the S9c Pro here, using that laptop as a Roon endpoint as well. All right. To test the DAC functionality of this, the XLR outputs went through a Little Bear XLR switch and then into my Vioelectric HPA V281 headphone amplifier and preamp from there. And so then a bunch of headphones got used for testing here of a variety here. So this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the highlights include Hi-Fi-Man HE1000 unveiled. The SJY Horizon Closed Carbon got very brief run here with the new ZMF Ori 3.0, which is in for review. That will be coming out hopefully in the not too distant future. Mastrop Sennheiser HD6XX Focal Radiance. Okay, there would have been others in there as well, but those are just some of the highlights, covering a variety of different types there in terms of like planars that are somewhat easier, somewhat more difficult to drive, and then there are like planars that are a bit higher impedance, lower impedance, or excuse me, dynamic drivers that are either high impedance or low impedance, trying to cover a range in there, and so forth. All right. So what did I learn about the S9c Pro through all of that? And as I said, like, this thing sounds pretty darn good, okay? All things considered. It trends towards like the warmth that happens in the S17 series of amplifiers, but doesn't go quite that far. I would call it just a little bit neutral warm, but there is just a touch, and I mean just a touch, of a little bit of extra perceived brightness over and above some other ESS chip-based DACs in particular that I have heard recently, but not so much to the point where I ever would consider this bright either. So, I mean, that's just kind of a 1,000-foot view of the perceived frequency response. So it leans towards warmth, but it is a little bit more closer to neutral than those S17 amplifiers are. Okay. So let's talk about the DAC performance first, and then we'll get into the amplifier performance. So the DAC itself, when I use the DAC outputs there, I think that's the more neutral of the two main components here, the DAC versus the headphone amp. I think the warmth to the sound here comes more from the amplifier than it does from the DAC. The DAC does a pretty good job, even though it's ESS-based, of not having that digital glare that ESS chip-based DACs can often be known for or have a reputation for having. It's pretty smooth up in the top end, okay, on that too. So like, I didn't really have any issues with fatigue or anything like that. So that is really well done. Okay, pretty good detail, pretty good resolution, and holography. There is a nice smoothness and naturalism to the presentation of the DAC through the pre-outs and all of that in there too. Overall level of performance of the DAC, I would say, because I did this direct comparison here, is pretty close to Shit's new Mimir DAC. Okay, I would put the Mimir just ever so slightly ahead of the DAC in the S9c Pro here in terms of like the performance ceiling on it, but it's very, very close. This thing is nipping right at the heels of the Mimir in terms of DAC quality. So that's pretty good company to be in, because the Mimir is a $300 piece and all of that. You take something that's about $400 and you can argue that the DAC alone in it should at least be right around the performance of a $300 standalone DAC, and using that standard right there, I think it gets really darn close to that and is within the neighborhood of perfectly acceptable in that way, I would say. All right, so then the amplifier in it is where things get a little bit more interesting, if you want, because I think the amplifier does bring in a little bit more flavor of warmth and fullness to it over and above what's attainable just from the DAC output, which is very much in line with what Aune has been doing with their amps in that S series line, which tend just a little bit warmer, right? Okay, so I mentioned the power output. The power output spec on this surprised me a little bit, and that's because things like the SJY Horizon Closed Carbon and even the new ZMF Ori, um, they are two different kinds of loads. The Horizon Closed Carbon is like very low impedance, but also low in sensitivity. It draws a lot of current. And the S9c Pro's amp here did a reasonable job with the closed carbon, but I would have to push the volume up to like, 85, 88, 90 out of 100, okay, in there to like kind of to like get it up to my reference level. So we're already kind of taxing and getting close to the maximum output level on there. But on the other hand, it was also just sometimes just a little bit lean in the bass, like particularly if a track is already a little bit leaner in the bass than like the bass on the Horizon Closed Carbon through the amplifier on the S9c Pro would be just a little bit leaner than it normally would be from that already bass lean track. If it's a bass heavy track, then you could kind of hear the bass be nice and full there, and it handled the closed carbon pretty well. If you have a track that can be both, depending on like where in the track you are, sometimes there are bass leaner parts and then sometimes there are more bass full parts, then you could hear the swing be a little bit unnaturally large, I think, between those two extremes about being bass lean and there being full in the bass there. And I think that just comes down to the amplifier was struggling until it got a lot of need on it, and then it delivered the power. It seemed to struggle with the lower level bass performance, okay, on that headphone. Similar experience, I think, with the Ori 3.0, okay, on there too. It was like a little bit bass lean. Now that's a higher impedance planar headphone at about 60 ohms. Middling sensitivity at about 95 decibels per milliwatt in there. And again, I think it was just a little bit more bass lean. That headphone is a little bit more bass lean, generally speaking, on this amp than it was on more powerful standalone amps. Okay, so I don't know about that 5 watt per channel spec, what that's into, like what load that's measured into, and whether or not you can actually achieve that with a real music waveform. I'm a little skeptical on that. However, easier driving things. The Hi-Fiman HE1000 Unveiled sounded really good through here. No complaints on that. Ditto the Focal Radiance. That also sounded fantastic on this thing. So that's a planar and a dynamic, both fairly easy driving. And the performance of the Massdrop Sennheiser HD6XX was also reasonably good on here. I have heard better on that one, but it had reasonably good full bass on it. Some nice holography to it that wasn't quite as 3 blobby as that headphone can be, and that sort of thing. So I think like that's like it was acceptable, I would call it, there with the high impedance HD6XX from here. So that's just a kind of a quick rundown of like, I'm not sure about the power output in that 5 watt per channel claim. I'm sure it probably gets to 5 watts per channel at some into some impedance load at 1 kilohertz probably. I just don't know the whole story behind that. And in practice with real world headphones, I've heard other amplifiers that are rated at less power sound more powerful and in control with some of those other headphones that I just mentioned over this one. Okay. Now the sound, though, as I said, leans towards a warmth. But not as much as the S9c Pro or Pro Evo do in there. The resolution, the dynamics, the impactfulness of the sound, the holography of the sound, and all of that, I think is also pretty good and would be market appropriate if you were just pull out just the amplifier in here and sell it for, in that $300 to $400 range, that would be fair. Okay, I think that is appropriate, okay, for what is in this unit here. So, I mean, you put together that you can, the DAC in it is, probably around a $300 DAC standalone. The amplifier is in that $300 to $400 range. You get a remote control, you get a whole bunch of outputs, you get a preamp functionality and all of that kind of stuff, a whole bunch of inputs, I should have said. You get preamp functionality and all that, then yeah, right about $700, I think, is a pretty good package for this unit here. So, I mean, where does it fit into the market overall, and again, that's a question that I'm gonna like save for a very near future video, because like this was the last piece, right? My next task is to go in and do a more in-depth comparison between this and some of those models of DAC amp that I mentioned earlier, close to it in price. Okay, and you know, just kind of lay those out there and put them in like various tiers. Where does this one go? Where does that one go? I do think that the S9c Pro here will stack up rather favorably. I don't know that I would call it my favorite unit in that group, but it's also like not the worst unit in that group either. And I think that its feature set and its sound and its flexibility will appeal to a fair number of users out there as well. So I think for this video, I've probably said enough. So I am Wave Theory. Thanks for watching my review of the Aune S9c Pro DAC with headphone amplifier in it. Please remember to like, subscribe, comment, check out my PayPal and my Patreon, and also consider becoming a channel member where you can get some benefits such as talking to me on Discord, seeing my videos early, and getting access to exclusive content. All right, thanks again for watching and enjoy the music.